What if I told you the greatest danger to your life isn't ignorance, but the illusion of knowing? Carl Jung understood this better than most. He once said, "Thinking is difficult. That's why most people judge." And hidden in that short sentence is a warning that could save you from some of life's worst mistakes. Because stupidity isn't simply about not knowing. It's about refusing to know. It's about turning away from truth, because truth feels too heavy to carry. We love to believe that stupidity belongs to other people, the ones who fall for scams, spread ridiculous rumors, or follow reckless leaders. But Jung knew the human mind too well to believe that lie. He understood that stupidity is not a fixed trait. It's a shadow, and that shadow lives in all of us. Under the wrong light, it can take over, and when it does, it can make even the most intelligent person act like a fool. The danger is, we rarely notice when it's happening to us. Stupidity is sneaky. It doesn't announce itself with flashing lights. It comes dressed as confidence. It comes wearing the mask of moral certainty. Jung would say that's because we have an unconscious, a part of the mind that hides truths we don't want to face. Sometimes, the stupidest thing we can do is refuse to look at ourselves honestly. Have you ever doubled down on a bad decision just because admitting you were wrong felt unbearable? That's your ego at work, and Jung believed the ego loves to protect itself at all costs, even if it destroys you in the process. This is why confirmation bias feels so good. You don't search for truth. You search for proof that you were right all along, and in doing so, you walk deeper into the fog. But here's the real twist. Stupidity often feels intelligent in the moment. That's why it's so dangerous. You tell yourself you're making a strong decision, you feel in control, but you're not thinking. You're reacting. You're acting from fear, pride, or envy, the very emotions that cloud reason. Jung would call this being possessed by an archetype, taken over by a force in the unconscious that runs the show while you pretend to be in charge. This is why stupidity spreads so easily in groups. When a crowd moves in one direction, it's hard to resist. Jung warned about the mass psyche, the way individuals lose themselves in the energy of a collective. In that state, personal responsibility disappears. You stop thinking as I and start thinking as we, even when we is charging off a cliff. Have you noticed how in a mob, even normal, decent people can commit horrible acts? That's not because they're naturally evil. It's because the mass psyche has replaced their individual conscience. And this doesn't just happen in riots or revolutions. It happens in boardrooms, in political parties, in online communities. It happens whenever we choose belonging over truth. Jung's insight here is brutal but clear. If you're not conscious of your own mind, someone else will think for you, and they might not have your best interests at heart. But here's where it gets personal. Stupidity isn't just about making bad decisions. It's about self-sabotage. It's harming yourself and others without even realizing it. Carlo Cipolla called it the most dangerous human force. But Jung would add that it's fueled by what we refuse to see in ourselves. We think we're avoiding pain by ignoring uncomfortable truths. But in reality, we're planting the seeds for bigger disasters. So, I have to ask you, where in your life are you absolutely certain you're right? Which beliefs do you defend without ever questioning? Jung would say that's exactly where you need to look, because that's where your shadow hides. That's where the unconscious can trick you into acting against your own best interests. The first step to escaping stupidity isn't reading more books or learning more facts. It's turning inward. It's asking, what am I pretending not to know? It's sitting with the discomfort of realizing you've been wrong before. And you will be wrong again. Most people can't do this. They'd rather live in the safety of their illusions. But safety built on illusions is fragile. The moment reality arrives, it shatters. And here's the cruel truth. The cost of stupidity isn't just personal. It ripples outward. One bad decision can destroy relationships, damage communities, even end lives. Jung believed that when we refuse to confront our own unconscious, we project our darkness onto others. That's when we start blaming, attacking, and destroying what we don't understand. It's not just unwise. It's dangerous. If you've been listening and thinking, this isn't me, this is about other people, pause. That's your shadow talking. The moment you think you're immune is the moment you're most at risk. Jung's warning was simple. Everything unconscious will one day come to the surface, and when it does, it often arrives as fate. If you don't face your own capacity for stupidity now, life will force you to later, and by then, the damage may already be done. Jung believed there's only one real antidote to stupidity: consciousness, but not just the surface-level awareness of what's going on around you. A deeper, more brutal honesty with yourself. Most people run from this. They drown themselves in distraction, surround themselves with people who agree with them, and repeat the same ideas like a safety blanket. It feels good. It feels safe. But safety is an illusion when you're building it on a lie. To become conscious, Jung said, you have to be willing to confront your shadow, the parts of yourself you've denied, repressed, or refused to see. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Your shadow isn't just made of ugly impulses or shameful memories. Sometimes it's full of truths you've buried because they'd force you to change. Change is hard. It threatens the ego. And the ego is stubborn. It would rather you live in a comfortable stupidity than face the pain of transformation. But what happens if you never face it? You stay in the loop. You repeat the same mistakes in different forms. You keep sabotaging yourself while blaming the world. You keep thinking the problem is out there when it's been inside you the whole time. And you'll swear you're thinking logically, when in reality, you're just defending your blind spots. Jung would call this being trapped in the unconscious. A prisoner who doesn't even realize they're in a cell. That's why knowledge alone doesn't save you. You can have degrees, credentials, and years of experience, and still live in stupidity if you've never done the work of self-examination. In fact, Jung warned that intellectuals might be more at risk because they can use their intelligence to rationalize their worst decisions. They build castles out of clever words, then live inside those castles, convinced they're safe, while reality slowly erodes the foundation. So how do you break out? The first step is humility. And humility is more than saying, I don't know everything. It's living with the constant awareness that you might be wrong right now. It's asking yourself questions you don't want to hear the answers to. Why am I so sure about this? What am I afraid of finding out? If I was wrong, how would I know? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are also the cracks where light gets in. Jung also believed in integrating the shadow, not destroying it. because the shadow isn't just a container for stupidity. It also holds the parts of you that can make you wise if you bring them into the light. Your stubbornness might hide resilience. Your pride might hide a hunger for mastery. Your fear might hide a warning you need to listen to. But you can't find any of that if you keep pretending your shadow doesn't exist. And let's be honest, looking into your own mind can be terrifying. You might see how many of your independent decisions were shaped by the crowd. You might realize you've been living in someone else's story, not your own. You might see how many of your arguments were never about truth, but about protecting your ego. That's a hard pill to swallow, but it's better than living in a lie. This is why Jung saw stupidity as a form of unconsciousness. It's not about lacking facts, it's about lacking self-awareness. It's about being asleep while thinking you're awake. And when you're asleep, you can be led anywhere. Into debt, into disaster, into hatred. Without ever realizing you've been walking with your eyes closed. The scary part, the world rewards this kind of sleepwalking. Entire industries are built on keeping you unconscious, feeding you comforting lies, flattering your beliefs, giving you enemies to blame so you never have to look inward. That's why stupidity feels easy. That's why it spreads faster than wisdom. And that's why choosing awareness feels like swimming against the current. But swim you must, because the cost of not doing it is far too high. Jung warned that what you refuse to make conscious will control your life, and you will call it fate. You'll say, I was just unlucky, when in reality, you were unseeing. You'll say, I didn't have a choice, when in reality, you just didn't recognize the choices you had. And the tragedy is, by the time you realize it, the damage may already be done. So, if you want to escape stupidity, your own and the world's, start here. Watch yourself, not in a paranoid way, but in a curious way. Notice your reactions. Notice when you feel the urge to defend something without thinking. Notice when the crowd is pulling you in a direction you haven't examined. That's where the real work begins. And here's the truth. This work never ends. You don't beat stupidity once and for all. You fight it every day in yourself and in the world. And the moment you stop, it starts winning again. But that fight is worth it, because every time you choose awareness over unconsciousness, you take back a little more control over your own life. There's a reason Jung treated the unconscious like a wild animal, powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous if ignored. He knew that when we refuse to face it, it doesn't just go away. It grows. It waits. And one day, it bursts into our lives in ways we can't control. That's when we say things like, I don't know what came over me, or I wasn't myself. But you were yourself. You were just the part of yourself you've been pretending doesn't exist. This is where stupidity becomes tragic, because by the time you notice it, it's often too late to undo the damage. Think about the person who destroys a friendship in a moment of pride. The investor who loses everything in a scheme they thought was bulletproof. The leader who leads people into disaster because they couldn't admit they were wrong. All of them believed they were right, until reality shattered their illusion. And the pain of that awakening is often worse than the mistake itself. Jung warned us that the shadow we refuse to face will eventually play out in the world around us. If you refuse to confront your own arrogance, you'll meet it in others. If you bury your fear, it will come back as paranoia. If you deny your capacity for harm, you'll project it onto enemies, blaming them for what you refuse to see in yourself. This is how wars begin, not just between nations, but inside families, communities, and within our own minds. You've probably seen this in your own life. Maybe you've met someone who always needs to be the smartest in the room. They dismiss anyone who challenges them. They surround themselves with people who nod and agree. It looks like confidence, but it's actually fear. Fear of seeing the limits of their own understanding. And that fear drives them to act in ways that hurt everyone, including themselves. That's the psychology of stupidity in its purest form. The desperate clinging to an illusion, even as it destroys you. And here's the hard truth. You and I are not exempt. We both have moments where we would rather protect our pride than face reality. We've both been the person who said, "I'm fine," when we weren't. We've both ignored warning signs, because listening to them meant admitting something we didn't want to admit. That's the shadow at work, and it's not going away just because we wish it would. But here's the hope Jung gave us. Awareness changes everything. The moment you shine light on the unconscious, it loses some of its power. The moment you catch yourself in a stupid impulse, about to lash out, about to follow the crowd without thinking, about to double down on a bad choice, you have a chance to stop. That tiny moment of awareness is the difference between a mistake and a disaster. The problem is, most people don't want that moment. Awareness means responsibility. It means you can't just say, "I didn't know." You can't just blame the group or the system or bad luck. You have to own your part. And owning your part is uncomfortable. That's why unconsciousness feels easier. But easy is not the same as safe. In fact, easy is often the path straight into catastrophe. Think about the times in history when millions followed destructive ideas without question. These weren't all uneducated people. Many were smart, skilled, and respectable. But they stopped thinking for themselves. They let the mass psyche take over. And once you give up that inner responsibility, you become capable of anything, because you believe someone else is in charge of your conscience. Jung would say that's when the collective shadow takes control, and the results are always destructive. So here's the question you have to ask yourself. Are you living consciously, or are you sleepwalking? Because you can't fight stupidity in others if you haven't faced it in yourself. You can't lead others out of the dark if you're still stumbling in it. And you can't build a life of real freedom if your decisions are being made by the parts of your mind you've never dared to confront. You might be thinking, but isn't this exhausting, to always question yourself? Yes, it's exhausting, but it's also the price of freedom. And the alternative is far worse, living under the control of impulses you don't understand, repeating mistakes you swore you'd never make, hurting people you love, and calling it fate. The truth is, stupidity will always be part of the human condition. Jung knew we could never erase it completely, but we can shrink its power. We can catch it in the act. We can refuse to let it run our lives unchecked. And if enough of us choose that, if enough of us choose consciousness over comfort, the ripple effect can change more than we think. Because here's the final warning. The shadow you ignore doesn't just belong to you. It leaks into the world. Your unconsciousness becomes part of the collective unconscious. Your refusal to face truth strengthens the collective shadow. And that's how societies fall. Not from the stupidity of a few, but from the blindness of many. If there's one thing Jung would want you to remember, it's this. Your mind is a battlefield, not between you and the world, but between you and yourself. On one side is your conscious self, the part that thinks, questions, reflects. On the other is your unconscious, the part that reacts, clings, hides, and resists change. Stupidity isn't just losing that battle. It's refusing to fight it in the first place. We've all been there. The heated argument where we stop listening and start defending. The impulse buy we regret 5 minutes later. The time we ignored advice because we knew better. These moments might seem small, but they're not. Each one is a crack where unconsciousness seeps in. And if you ignore those cracks, they widen. Before you know it, you're living in a house that's collapsing. And you're the one pulling out the beams. Jung understood that the only way to win this inner battle is to keep showing up for it. Every day, every decision, every moment you feel that pull toward the easy answer, the comforting lie, the mindless following of the crowd, that's your chance to fight. And here's the good news. You don't have to win every time. You just have to notice. Noticing is the first victory. Because once you see the shadow, it's no longer in complete control. But don't mistake awareness for comfort. Real awareness hurts. It shows you your weaknesses, your blind spots, your past mistakes. It forces you to admit you've been wrong, sometimes for years. It humbles you in ways the ego hates. And that's exactly why it's so powerful. Because every time you face that pain, you take back a piece of yourself from the grip of unconsciousness. Every time you choose truth over pride, you weaken the shadow. And here's where the psychology of stupidity becomes a choice. You can live in the halflight, letting your unconscious run the show, drifting along with the mass psyche until you wake up in a life you don't recognize. Or you can turn and face the darkness inside you, knowing it will never disappear completely, but determined not to let it rule you. Jung never promised this would be easy. In fact, he said the opposite. But he knew it was the only path to becoming whole. Think about the ripple effect if you choose this path. When you live consciously, you don't just protect yourself. You protect others. You're less likely to harm without cause, less likely to spread fear or lies, less likely to fuel the collective shadow. You become a stabilizing force in a world that desperately needs it. And maybe, just maybe, your example gives someone else the courage to wake up too. But it starts here, with you. Right now, ask yourself, where have I been asleep? What have I refused to see? Who have I hurt because I was protecting my own illusion? These aren't comfortable questions, but they are the doorway out of stupidity's grip. And the sooner you walk through that doorway, the sooner you stop being part of the problem and start becoming part of the solution. Jung once said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That's the heart of it. Stupidity isn't fate. It's the result of letting your unconscious drive without ever checking the map. But fate can be rewritten, if you take the wheel. So here's my challenge to you. For the next week, watch yourself like a scientist. Notice the moments when you feel the need to defend without listening, when you follow without questioning, when you react without thinking. Don't judge yourself. Just notice. And every time you catch yourself, you've already begun to win, because in that moment, you're awake. And an awake mind is the one thing stupidity can't control. If you take nothing else from this, take this. You are capable of incredible insight, but only if you dare to see yourself clearly. The shadow will always be there. The unconscious will always whisper. But you get to decide whether you live in the dark or walk toward the light. And that choice, in the smallest moments, is what separates a life ruled by stupidity from a life shaped by wisdom. One day, you're going to look back on your life and see a pattern. The choices that shaped you, the moments that defined you, the people you kept or lost along the way. And in that moment, you'll face a question no one else can answer for you. Did I live awake, or did I sleepwalk through my years? That's the quiet tragedy of stupidity. It doesn't always look like disaster. Sometimes it looks like wasted potential, like years spent chasing the wrong things, like friendships that faded because pride spoke louder than love. Sometimes it's not the explosion that ruins a life, but the slow drip of unexamined habits and unconscious choices. And then, when you finally wake up, you realize you can't get that time back. Jung's warning was never about shaming people for their mistakes. It was about shaking us awake before the mistakes became permanent. He knew the unconscious is patient. It will wait for you to get tired, to stop questioning, to start coasting. And when you do, it will quietly take the wheel. It will drive you to places you swore you'd never go. And by the time you notice, the road back will be long and steep. But it doesn't have to be that way. You can start right now. You can choose awareness in the smallest of things. Noticing your tone when you speak to someone you love. Questioning that instant flare of defensiveness when someone challenges you, pausing before you repeat something you haven't checked. These moments might seem small, but they are the stitches that hold your life together. Ignore them, and the fabric begins to tear. I want you to think about someone you admire, not for their success, but for their clarity, their groundedness, their ability to stand steady when everyone else is swept away. That's not luck. That's not talent. That's the fruit of a lifetime of fighting unconsciousness, of facing their own shadow again and again, no matter how ugly it got. That is the work, and it's the same work waiting for you. You will fail at it sometimes. You will act without thinking. You will say things you regret. You will follow the crowd when you should have stood alone. That's part of being human. But the measure of your life won't be whether you were perfect. It will be whether you kept coming back to awareness, whether you kept dragging the light into the corners of your mind, no matter how dark they felt. Because in the end, Jung's truth is simple. The battle against stupidity is the battle to truly know yourself. And if you win that battle, even a little, you become the kind of person who can't be easily manipulated, who can't be swept into madness by the crowd, who can't be made to destroy what you love for reasons you don't understand. You become the kind of person the world desperately needs. So here's my final question to you, the one I hope will follow you long after you've stopped listening. When the unconscious whispers, will you listen? Or will you look it in the eye and say, not today? The choice is yours, and it always has been.